Right, so it comes to something when you can be sentenced to years in prison, not even for actually going on a protest, but just planning one on Zoom. But that is what 5 Just Stop Oil protesters have been sentenced to. Our human right to protest criminalised by the former human rights barrister, now our Prime Minister, in his apparent first authoritarian display that so many of us warned was coming when the reality of a Keir Starmer premiership became more apparent to more people. Why, after all, did he not do away with Suella Braverman's pernicious policing bill already, rather than use it after all? This is Minority Report criminality. Just thinking about doing something the powers that be don't like is enough to get you locked up now. And in this case, the longest sentence ever handed out for non-violent protest, 21 years between 5 people, for doing something that is our human right to do. Protest. You don't have to agree with these people and what they were protesting over, but you absolutely should defend their right to protest over that, to say what they have to say. And when things don't even get that far, remaining at the planning stage, so to speak, we're descending into fascism within just 2 weeks of Starmer taking power.
We come in peace. We come to ask for the right to peacefully protest to protect our planet. We ask that if truths need to be told, they should be heard, and to point out that it would be wise to listen and heed those truths in a time of global crisis at this critical point in our species' history. In recent days, we've witnessed a violent assault on American democracy. It is my manifest belief that by retaining our enshrined right to peaceful protest, we can avert a descent into violence against people and property here in the UK. Be clear. Be very, very clear. This is not just about climate activism. The laws that have been drafted, the injustices that are being wrought, threaten all rights of free speech, our rights to free speech. We stand here today because our future security may be compromised by the reckless and irresponsible erosion of our human rights, of our fundamental freedoms. We stand outside a court where access to justice has been ruled impossible, where 5 peaceful protesters have been denied the right to properly assert what motivated their alleged crimes, where the jury have been robbed of their fundamental right to acquit defendants on the basis of their conscience. I stand here because I believe this represents the direct theft of our freedom.
Right, so that was a clip of Chris Packham there, part of a speech he gave outside of Southwark Crown Court where the 5 Just Stop Oil protesters were sentenced, laying out in stark terms the ramifications for us all, because this goes far beyond just climate protesters and the issue of climate change, which literally threatens all of our existences, of course, and should be taken seriously by governments and isn't taken as serious as it should be. But more than that, this is an assault on our human rights. This was all done under the Tories' police crime sentencing and courts bill. Suella Braverman's wet dream of a court bill, draconian as that was, and here's Starmer overseeing even harsher deployment of it than they were. Absolutely, you can be critical of the judge involved too. I have been. I'll come on to him in a moment. But if you think I'm being overly harsh in my assessment of Starmer in relation to this, having only been in the job for 2 weeks after all, under this same law, for the crime, thought crime as this is, Section 78 of the PCSCA Act 2022, for conspiracy to commit a public nuisance, the crime of maybe thinking of protesting in a manner the police can arbitrarily judge for themselves, let's not forget, to be a nuisance, 50 youth demand protesters were also arrested elsewhere, protesting as they were against arms sales to Israel and for a free Palestine. Now here we ostensibly have protesters protesting about 2 things we all know Keir Starmer does not give a toss about: Palestine and climate change. He's on record as having said he hates tree huggers and is currently seeing through an attempt to get arrest warrants applied for by the International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan against Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister Yoav Gallant quashed. Facts speak for themselves. Deeds speak louder than words. And whilst climate change protesters are heading to our overcrowded prisons, though, to alleviate that overcrowding, on the same day all of this happened, the new Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood said 5,500 currently serving prisoners are to be released early to avert overcrowding disaster, to prevent the prison system facing imminent collapse. So who's being released then? And who's being released early? And what crimes are they guilty of, and are therefore deemed functionally as less of an issue than climate protest is? We don't know at this moment in time. There are claims that those sentenced for violent crimes won't be let out, but that doesn't tell us who will. This is also apparently just the first part of some 20,000 early releases under discussion for prisoners after serving just 40% of their sentences. If the prison system is in such a state, well, perhaps privatising it was a stupid idea then. Just a thought. Well, the sentences themselves that have been given to these 5 climate change protesters from Just Stop Oil also give you something of an indication of how severe a crime protest now is under the Starmer regime. Here's a handy graphic produced by Stats for Lefties where, despite being sent down for something like domestic violence means you might not be eligible for one of those early releases, your sentence is less than that of one of these protesters. Same goes for drug crimes and robbery. That is one royally messed up set of priorities, but then the judge wouldn't even let the defendants mention climate change as part of their defence. The judge involved here is a guy called Christopher Hayhere. I hope I'm saying that right. It's an odd surname, isn't it? And to give you a flavour of his thinking, though, here's an excerpt from The Guardian's coverage of the case relating to him. Hayhere admitted there was a scientific and social consensus that human-made climate breakdown was happening and action should be taken to avert it. I acknowledge that at least some of the concerns motivating you are, at least to some extent, shared by many, he said. But the plain fact is that each of you has some time ago crossed the line from concerned campaigner to fanatic. You have appointed yourselves as the sole arbiters of what should be done about climate change, bound neither by the principles of democracy nor the rule of law. And your fanaticism makes you entirely heedless of the rights of your fellow citizens. You have taken it upon yourselves to decide that your fellow citizens must suffer disruption and harm, and how much disruption and harm they must suffer, simply so that you may parade your views. Now take that attitude towards a Zoom call, as this was, let's not forget that, and then take into consideration that last year, a man who you might remember drove his car straight into the gates of Downing Street. Hayhere was the judge overseeing that case, and he gave him a suspended sentence. Back in April of this year, he excused a police officer who had sex in his patrol car with a vulnerable woman he'd offered a lift home to as a moment of madness, and gave him a suspended sentence. In 2017, a struck-off lawyer who was charging refugees for legal work, taking advantage of vulnerable people, saw Hayhere hand down a fine of just under £3,000, and in 2019 handed down a sentence of community service to the creator of kids' TV show Rastamouse after they were found guilty of £8,000 worth of benefit fraud. I just can't help thinking he's got a bit of an issue with climate change protesters when you examine some of his past record on sentencing. What do you think, though? Roger Hallam, though, the co-founder of Just Stop Oil, but also of Extinction Rebellion, and who got the longest sentence of 5 years imprisonment of the 5 people involved here, has written a rather lengthy thread on Twitter detailing the ongoings. But in relation to his defence, he said, "In the trial, I swore before God to tell the truth. The truth is the science. The science is clear. We're heading for billions of deaths and ecological collapse. To prove this, I presented the jury with a 250-page dossier of leading scientists' research as evidence in my defence. This was denied by the judge as an invalid. Climate science is now illegal in the British courtroom. I then began to speak about the apocalyptic conditions humanity faces, floods, wildfires, mass heat deaths, and was silenced by the judge. He sent out the jury and threatened to arrest me if I didn't stop. Instead, I stayed in the dock and argued that until I was given the right to complete my defence, I would not move. Even the prosecution tried to argue in my defence, and the judge let me continue." What a sham. You can agree or disagree with these people from Just Stop Oil. You might not even like their methods of protest, but for God's sake defend their human right to do so, or it'll be something you do relate to next. How long before it is striking workers protesting that get locked up instead? Trade unions getting completely neutered? Where does this actually end after all? Look at it this way. To get the vote, women used to smash windows. They threw themselves in front of horses, chained themselves up and landed themselves in prison, just as these people have. Their slogan being at the time, "Deeds not words," the suffragette movement. Do you disagree with women having the right to vote now? Because this is what they had to do to get it. And once again, on a different subject in this day and age, to draw attention to a critical issue of our time, protest is required to get that attention again. Also compare this to other examples of heavy-handed imprisonment. In 2012, members of the Russian band Pussy Riot got locked up for the crime of premeditated hooliganism motivated by religious hatred or hostility. Remember that case? They had had a pop at Putin, basically. That was more like it. But they were sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for thought crime as well, in intents. And at that time, a minister in the Foreign Office here described that sentence as unjust and disproportionate. A judge here just sentenced 5 climate change protesters to 21 years between them for thought crimes too. What say that foreign minister now then? Another example from another perspective is the 72 people killed and 70 injured in London in 2017 that nobody to date has been held accountable for in a criminal court of law. That sounds like a massive travesty, doesn't it, put like that? Well, that was the Grenfell tragedy for you, and it absolutely is a travesty. But that is exactly what I'm talking about. The further nasty little detail going around about this story, though, is how the police were tipped off as to what these people were actually planning. You can't imagine they police Zoom meetings very often, and apparently that is down to the alleged infiltration of this Zoom call by a reporter, and I use that word in the loosest possible sense, from the Murdoch scum, who then tipped the police off. Allegedly, the same reporter was then invited along to witness the arrest of Roger Hallam. That rag truly is the absolute pits. Obviously, social media has had its say as well, but I'm drawn to comments from politicians in relation to this first and foremost. Former Security Minister and one of the remaining Tory MPs we have now, Tom Tugendhat, simply said good to the sentence, but then he would. Says a lot about their party. They brought in these draconian laws. Former Labour MP Claudia Webb, however, took a justifiably opposing view by saying, wow, imprisoned for 5 years for taking part in a Zoom call. This is fascism, a total miscarriage of justice and in breach of basic human rights. It is not wrong to peacefully protest against climate injustice, denial and disaster. Completely right. And Green Party Deputy Leader Zach Polanski had also weighed in on this, and he said, conspiracy to commit a public nuisance is a deeply authoritarian description that should send shivers down the spine of all of us who want to live in a free society. Even worse when the real crime is consecutive governments who have played down the climate emergency. The trial was also attended, as it happens, by the UN Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders, Michel Forst, who said of the sentence, today is a dark day for peaceful environmental protest in the UK, he said. This sentence should shock the conscience of any member of the public. It should also put all of us on high alert on the state of civic rights and freedoms in the United Kingdom. Rulings like today set a very dangerous precedent, not just for environmental protest, but any form of peaceful protest that may, at one point or another, not align with the interests of the government of the day. Factually, Labour should already be dismantling Suella Braverman's nasty police and crime bill, instead of taking advantage of it to attack people campaigning on issues we know Starmer has little sympathy with. Solidarity to the Whole Truth 5. Meanwhile, as far as Gaza goes, Starmer is apparently working on a way to rid himself of independent MPs and election candidates by delegitimising those outside of a political party from standing or becoming MPs. Nothing quite like consolidating your power like legislating your rivals out of existence, is there? Fascism, again. But check out that story in this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.